The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Hala City as the rope creaked against the wooden beam. A man dangled above the dirt street, boots twitching, while a crowd of grinning cowboys placed bets on how long he'd last. The desert wind carried their laughter across the settlement like a promise of cruelty. $5 says he doesn't last another minute, one of them called out, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. A stranger rode into view then, sitting tall in his saddle despite the weariness that clung to him like trail dust. He wore a battered hat pulled low over his face, and his clothes spoke of long miles and longer nights. Something about the way he held himself, shoulders squared, spine straight, suggested military bearing, though the war had been over for years now. "Cut him down," the stranger said quietly. The cowboys turned as one, their grins fading into something harder. The leader, a thick-necked man with cruel eyes, stepped forward. "You stay out of this, Yank. We'll cut him down when he quits kicking." The stranger's hand moved to his sidearm with practiced ease. The rope parted with a single shot, and the hanged man collapsed into the dirt, gasping for breath. Before the cowboys could reach for their own weapons, the stranger had already wheeled his horse around. "Mister, you better ride with us," one of the rescued man's companions called out. "Ain't no yellow egg Yankee boys going with us," the thick-necked cowboy snarled, but his hand stayed well away from his gun. The stranger said nothing. He'd learned long ago that some men only understood the language of violence, and he'd spoken enough of that language to last several lifetimes. Instead, he simply rode on, leaving the cowboys to their rage and the rescued man to his gratitude. The group that picked him up on the trail called themselves entrepreneurs, though anyone with half a brain could see they were outlaws. There was Turk, the self-proclaimed leader with grandiose dreams of building an army in the wilderness. Billy Kaplinger, young and trigger-happy, with a loyalty that bordered on worship for Turk, and a handful of others whose names would be forgotten by history, as would their graves. They'd been riding together for a week now, the stranger and this ragtag band of bank robbers. They called him Yellowlegs on account of the faded cavalry stripe still visible on his dusty trousers. He never corrected them, never offered his real name. Names were for men with futures, and he'd left his future bleeding out in a Missouri field 5 years ago. "I hear they got a new bank and an old marshal over at Hala City," Billy said as they rode through a canyon painted red by the setting sun. "That beats cheating at cards, don't it?" Turk grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Let's go." The stranger rode in silence, his mind elsewhere. Somewhere in this godforsaken territory was a man he'd been hunting for half a decade. A Confederate soldier with a Bowie knife and a taste for cruelty. The kind of man who'd try to scalp a Union sergeant in a drunken rage, leaving him for dead in the mud and blood of a forgotten battlefield. The stranger's hand went unconsciously to his hat, pulling it lower. Beneath that battered brim lay the evidence of that night, scars that ran deep, ridges of healed flesh that no amount of time would ever smooth away. He'd worn the hat day and night for 5 years, through rain and sun and snow, never once removing it in the presence of another soul. Revenge was patient. Revenge could wait until the right moment. Hala City rose from the prairie like a mirage, all false-fronted buildings and desperate hope. It was the kind of town that sprang up wherever there was money to be made and law to be broken, a place where fortunes were won and lost on the turn of a card, where violence simmered just beneath the surface of every transaction. "Town looks quiet," one of the outlaws observed as they rode in. "Yeah, I bet the marshal's asleep," another replied. Billy laughed. "Never shoot a man in his sleep, Yellowlegs. You being a Yankee, that is." The stranger ignored him. He'd learned not to rise to their baiting. Let them think what they wanted about Yankees and honor and the proper way to kill a man. He knew truths they couldn't imagine, had seen things in the war that would haunt him until his dying day. They hitched their horses at the edge of town and walked toward the main street with the casual arrogance of men who believed themselves untouchable. The stranger hung back, his eyes scanning the buildings, the alleys, the faces in the windows. Old habits died hard. "We ain't taking the bank today," Turk announced suddenly. Billy's face fell. "You giving the orders now?" "It looks that way, don't it?" Turk said with a grin. "We'll wait until the time is right. Billy, get the horses to the livery stable." The young man bristled. "Are you talking to me?" "Well, your name's Billy, ain't it?" The stranger watched the exchange with the detached interest of a man who'd seen this dance 100 times before. Young men and their pride. Leaders and their followers. The dance always ended the same way, in blood and dust and regret. The saloon was closed, which struck him as odd for the middle of the day. Through the windows, he could see townsfolk gathered inside, heads bowed. A church service, he realized. These frontier towns and their strange customs. Some held Sunday on Monday, some on Saturday, depending on when the preacher could make his rounds. "Bar's closed on account of church," the bartender said nervously when they pushed through the doors anyway. Turk's laugh boomed across the empty room. "I give my rallies, and sure as how fast you pull six-shooters. See how fast you can take the cork out of that bottle." The stranger moved to a corner, away from the windows, and waited. He'd wait all day if he had to. He'd been waiting 5 years already. The congregation inside the saloon represented everything that was wrong and right about these frontier settlements. There were families trying to build something decent in the wilderness. There were merchants and farmers, blacksmiths and stable boys. And there, near the back, wearing a red dress that screamed defiance in the face of judgment, sat a woman with auburn hair and a boy of about 8 beside her. The stranger recognized the look on her face immediately. He'd seen it in mirrors for 5 years. The set jaw of someone who refused to bow to shame, the hard eyes of someone who'd been hurt and had learned to hurt back. She held a prayer book in her hands like a shield, and the boy sat close to her side as if they could protect each other from the whispers and the stares. "Imagine coming in here like she was respectable," one of the town women muttered loud enough to be heard. "Bringing her Woods Colt with her. Imagine she wouldn't know his father if she saw him again. Poor boy." The woman in red, Kit, someone called her, kept her gaze straight ahead, ignoring the poison dressed up as piety. The boy's hand found hers, small fingers wrapping tight, and something in the stranger's chest twisted at the sight. The preacher, a weathered man with the look of someone who'd seen both the best and worst of humanity, stood at the front of the makeshift church. "I see we have some new faces today, male and female. I welcome you." Then his eyes found the outlaws still wearing their hats. "This here is a preaching house. You'll take your hats off." The stranger's hand went to his brim instinctively, then stopped. He couldn't. Wouldn't. "Mister, I never met a man who wouldn't take off his hat," the preacher said, his voice harder now. "You get on with your preaching," the stranger replied quietly. Turk laughed, delighted by the confrontation. "He's kind of dirty about that hat, ain't he? Never seen nothing like it. Don't even take it off to sleep." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Then Turk stood abruptly, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "I'm asking you, my friends, any man, woman, or child that reckons they want to go to hell, I say let that man, woman, or child stand up and be counted." The preacher stared at him. "You mean to stand there and say you intend to go to that place?" "I sure do, parson. Tell you something else. Any man in this room that don't get to his feet right now and join me is going there pronto." It was pure theater, pure Turk, all bluster and threat. But it worked. The congregation scattered like startled birds, desperate to escape the confrontation. In the chaos, the stranger saw the woman in red gather the boy close and move toward the door. Their eyes met for just a moment. Hers were green, he noticed, the color of sage after rain. They held questions and accusations and a weariness that matched his own. Then she was gone, disappearing into the bright afternoon sunlight with the boy at her side. The stranger turned his attention back to the saloon, to the outlaws laughing over their whiskey, to Turk spinning his grand plans of empire and conquest. But his mind was elsewhere, caught on the memory of green eyes and a small hand clutching a prayer book, on judgment and defiance, and the particular brand of loneliness that came from being cast out. He understood that loneliness, had lived with it for 5 years ever since a Confederate blade had carved away not just his scalp, but any chance at a normal life. How could he offer his face to a woman? How could he walk into a church or a restaurant or any respectable establishment and expect to be treated as anything other than a monster? The hat stayed on. It always stayed on. "All that money just sitting there across the street," Billy said, staring at the bank with hungry eyes. "Waiting on a yellow-legged Yankee." The stranger said nothing. Let them think he was cautious or afraid or calculating the odds. The truth was simpler and more complicated. He hadn't come to Gila City for money. He'd come because the trail had led him here. Because somewhere in this territory was the man who'd tried to take his life and left him with something worse. A reason to keep living that had nothing to do with actually living. Revenge was a hard master. It gave you purpose, but took away possibility. It kept you moving forward, but never let you arrive anywhere that mattered. 5 years of searching, and what did he have to show for it? Scars hidden beneath a hat and a rage that had cooled from white-hot to something colder and more dangerous. The church meeting ended, and the congregation spilled back into the afternoon heat. The stranger watched them go, these people trying to build something civilized in the wilderness. He'd once believed in civilization, in law and order, and the rightness of causes. The war had taught him otherwise. "Nice to meet you, ma'am," Billy was saying to someone on the street. The stranger looked over and saw it was the woman in red, Kit, still holding the boy's hand. "My name's Billy. Billy Kaplinger." "Get out," she said, her voice flat and hard. Billy backed away, hands raised in mock surrender, but his grin suggested he found the rejection more entertaining than insulting. Young men and their games, the stranger thought. They never learned until it was too late. Turk sidled up beside him. "That pretty redhead just went in the saloon. Guess that makes today Sunday." The stranger's jaw tightened. He recognized the tone in Turk's voice, had heard it before in the voices of men who thought power gave them rights. He'd killed men who spoke in that tone during the war. Sometimes he regretted it. Sometimes he didn't. "Get your horses," Turk announced suddenly. "We're taking that bank." Finally, the moment they'd been riding toward for days. The stranger felt nothing, no excitement, no fear, no anticipation, just the same cold emptiness that had filled him since Missouri. They moved with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this before. Turk took the lead. Billy guarded the door. The others secured the horses. The stranger found himself inside the bank with a gun in his hand and a teller staring at him with wide, terrified eyes. "Open the safe," Turk commanded. The teller fumbled with the combination, his hands shaking. Behind them, the street remained quiet. The marshal was probably still wherever he'd been hiding during the church service. Poor security for a town with a new bank and old money. Then gunfire erupted outside. The stranger moved to the window, his body reacting before his mind caught up. Years of training, of survival, had made certain instincts automatic. Through the dusty glass, he could see Billy in the street, gun drawn, facing down a figure in the shadows. More shots, a woman screaming, and then, cutting through all of it, a child's voice calling out, "Mama!" The stranger was out the door before he realized he'd made the decision to move. Training be damned, caution be damned. A child was crying, and something in that sound cut through 5 years of careful numbness. The scene in the street was chaos. The woman in red, Kit, stood frozen in the middle of the dusty road, her green eyes wide with shock. At her feet lay the boy, the one who'd been clutching her hand in church. A spreading pool of crimson stained the dirt beneath him. "He's dead," someone said. A townsman, his voice thick with horror. "Is them outlaws killed him? They did some wild shooting." "No," Kit said softly, then louder, with a rage that made even the outlaws take a step back. "No, it was me." The stranger saw it then, the rifle in her hand still smoking. She'd been defending herself, firing at the outlaws, and in the chaos of bullets and fear, her shot had gone wide, had found the one target she would have died to protect. The rifle fell from her hands. She dropped to her knees beside the boy, gathering him into her arms with a sound that was too raw to be called a cry. It was the sound of something breaking, something that could never be made whole again. The stranger stood motionless, his hand still on his gun, forgotten. He'd seen death before. God knew he'd caused enough of it. But this was different. This was waste. This was innocence destroyed by the collision of violence and bad luck, and a town full of people who had judged without mercy and would now whisper with satisfaction that they'd been right all along about the woman in red and her bastard son. Turk grabbed his arm. "We need to go. Now." The stranger shook him off. His eyes were locked on Kit, on the way she rocked back and forth with the boy's body in her arms, on the blood that stained her red dress even redder, on the absolute devastation in her face as she realized what she'd done. "Yellow legs," Turk hissed. "The marshal will be here any second. We gotta ride." Still, The stranger didn't move. Couldn't move. Because in Kit's grief, he saw something he recognized. He saw 5 years of his own life. 5 years of carrying death, of letting it define every choice, every breath, every moment. 5 years of being dead inside while his body kept moving forward. And he saw what happened when revenge finally caught up with you, when you got what you wanted and realized it was the worst thing that could have happened. Kit looked up then, her eyes finding his across the dust and the distance and the gathering crowd. In that moment, something passed between them. Recognition, maybe. Understanding. The acknowledgement that they were both marked by violence, both cast out by circumstance, both condemned to carry burdens no one else could see or understand. "I'm taking him to Siringo," Kit said suddenly, her voice stronger now despite the tears tracking through the dust on her face. "I'm burying him next to his father." The townspeople murmured. The mayor, a portly man with a politician's practiced concern, stepped forward. "Now, Kit, you can't do that. It's smack in the middle of Apache territory, and there ain't nobody willing to go with you." "I'm not asking anybody to go with me," Kit replied. "But Kit," I said, "I'm not asking." She stood then, still cradling the boy, and walked toward the undertaker's office with her head high and her shoulders squared. The same defiant posture she'd worn in church, the same refusal to bow to judgment or grief or the impossibility of what she intended to do. The stranger watched her go. Then he turned to Turk. "I'm riding with her." Turk stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "You're what?" "To Siringo. I'm going with her." "The hell you are. We got a bank to rob and Apaches to avoid and—" The stranger's hand went to his gun, not threatening, but ready, just ready. "I'm riding with her," he repeated quietly. Billy laughed, the sound harsh in the sudden silence. "Didn't know you was the noble type, yellow legs." "I'm not," the stranger said. And it was true. There was nothing noble about what he felt. No righteousness, no heroism, just the sudden, desperate need to do something that wasn't driven by hatred. To make one choice in 5 years that had nothing to do with revenge. Maybe that made him a fool. Probably did. But he'd been a fool before and survived it. Turk's face darkened. "You're making a mistake. That woman's bad luck, and Siringo's just a graveyard full of scorpions and regret. You won't make it 10 miles before the Apaches find you." "Then I'll die 10 miles out," the stranger said. "Better than dying here." He turned and walked away from the outlaws, from the bank and its money and Turk's grand dreams of empire. Walked away from 5 years of single-minded purpose and toward something he couldn't name but recognized anyway. Kit had already procured a wagon by the time he found her. She was loading supplies with mechanical efficiency, her face set in hard lines that dared anyone to offer sympathy or advice. The boy's body lay wrapped in canvas in the back, small and still beneath the desert sun. "I don't need your help," she said without looking at him. "Didn't offer any," the stranger replied. "Just figured I'd ride in the same direction." "Why?" It was a fair question. He didn't have a good answer. "Maybe I'm tired of going in the direction I've been going." Kit looked at him then, really looked at him. Her green eyes were red-rimmed from crying, but sharp with intelligence. She was trying to read him, to understand what kind of man would abandon his companions to ride into Apache territory with a woman he didn't know, to bury a child who wasn't his. "You one of them bank robbers?" she asked. "Was," he admitted. "Don't figure I am anymore." "What are you then?" The stranger thought about that. What was he? Not a soldier. That war was over. Not an outlaw. He'd just walked away from that life. Not a whole man. Not with the scars hidden beneath his hat. "Just a man riding to Siringo," he finally said. Kit studied him a moment longer, then turned back to her wagon. "Suit yourself. But I'm not stopping for you if you fall behind, and I'm not nursing you if you get an arrow in your gut." "Fair enough." They left Hyla City as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. Behind them, the town watched with a mixture of pity and relief, glad to see the woman in red leaving, sorry it took a child's death to drive her out. The stranger didn't look back. Looking back was for people with something to return to. He had only forward now, into Apache territory with a grieving woman and a dead boy, and no clear idea what he was doing or why. But for the first time in 5 years, the weight of his hat felt a little lighter. The scars beneath it burned less fiercely. and the rage that had sustained him through thousands of miles and countless nights felt less like purpose and more like the cage it had always been. Revenge could wait, had to wait, because riding away from Hala City toward an uncertain death in the desert, wastes felt more like living than anything he'd done since the war ended. Maybe that was enough. Maybe it had to be. The wagon wheels creaked as they rolled across the hardpan, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, a coyote howled. The sound echoed across the emptiness, lonely and defiant and somehow hopeful despite everything. The stranger urged his horse forward, keeping pace with Kit's wagon. Neither of them spoke. There would be time for words later, or there wouldn't. Either way, they were committed now to the trail ahead, to whatever waited in Siringo, to the possibility of something beyond grief and vengeance and the particular kind of death that came from refusing to truly live. The desert swallowed them whole, and behind them, Turk and Billy watched from the edge of town with calculating eyes. "Reckon we should follow them?" Billy asked. Turk grinned, revealing those tobacco-stained teeth. "Let's see how far they get first. That yellow leg knows where we hid the bank money, and I got a feeling about that woman. Something worth more than money, if you know what I mean." They mounted their horses and rode out after nightfall, keeping their distance, waiting for the right moment. Because in the end, men like Turk always waited for the right moment. It was what separated the survivors from the dead. And in the darkness between Hala City and Siringo, with Apaches in the hills and death-riding shotgun, the right moment would come soon enough. The first night on the trail passed in silence, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the soft sound of Kit's breathing as she drove through the darkness. The stranger rode alongside, his eyes scanning the horizon for signs of movement, his hand never far from his rifle. The moon rose full and bright, casting long shadows across the desert floor, turning the landscape into something alien and beautiful and deadly all at once. They made camp just before dawn in a shallow draw, where a few scraggly mesquite trees offered minimal shelter. Kit climbed down from the wagon with movements that spoke of bone-deep exhaustion, but her face remained set in those same hard lines. She moved to the back of the wagon where the canvas-wrapped bundle lay and stood there for a long moment, her hand resting on the rough fabric. The stranger busied himself with building a small fire, keeping the flames low to avoid drawing attention. He'd learned this country during the war, learned its rhythms and dangers, learned how to read the land and the sky and the subtle signs that meant the difference between living and dying. Apache territory was unforgiving to those who didn't respect it. "You should rest," he said quietly, not looking at Kit. "I'll keep watch." "I don't need you to keep watch." Her voice was brittle, ready to snap. "Didn't say you did. Said I would." She turned to face him then, and in the pre-dawn light he could see the exhaustion carved into her features. The tears had dried, leaving salt tracks through the dust on her cheeks. Her green eyes were hollowed out, haunted by something worse than grief, by guilt. "Why are you really here?" she asked. "Don't tell me it's because you just happened to be riding this direction." The stranger poured coffee from the pot he'd set on the fire, the bitter smell rising in the cool air. "Maybe I got tired of the direction I was heading." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I got." Kit studied him for a long moment, then accepted the cup of coffee he offered. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and she flinched slightly at the contact. Not from fear, he realized, but from something else. From the surprise of human touch that wasn't meant to hurt or take or judge. "They called you Yellowlegs back in town," she said. "That your real name? It'll do. You always this close-mouthed? You always this curious about men you don't want around?" A ghost of a smile flickered across her face, so brief he might have imagined it. "Fair point." She sipped the coffee, grimaced at the strength of it, but kept drinking. "You were in the war." It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. "Yes, ma'am." "Union?" "What gave it away? The cavalry stripe or the fact that everyone keeps calling me Yank?" This time the smile lasted a fraction longer. "Both, I suppose." She lowered herself to sit on a flat rock near the fire, cradling the coffee cup in both hands. "My husband fought too, for the South. He survived 4 years of battles just to get killed by Apaches 2 months after we arrived in Siringo." "I'm sorry." "Are you?" I thought Union men would be glad to hear about dead Confederates. The stranger shook his head. War's over. Being glad about dead men seems like a waste of energy. Is that why you wear the hat all the time? Because of something that happened in the war? His hand went instinctively to the brim, pulling it lower. That's not your concern. You're right, it's not. But her eyes lingered on his face, or what she could see of it beneath the shadow of the hat. I'm just trying to figure out what kind of man leaves his friends and his money to ride into Apache territory with a stranger. Maybe the kind who's tired of being the man he was. Kit considered this, then nodded slowly. I can understand that. She drained the last of her coffee and stood. I'm going to try to sleep for an hour. If you're going to run off with my wagon and supplies, do it quietly so I don't have to shoot you. Yes, ma'am. She climbed into the back of the wagon, curling herself around the canvas-wrapped bundle like she could still protect the boy, even in death. The stranger watched until her breathing evened out, then turned his attention back to the desert awakening around them. The sun rose fierce and unforgiving, bleaching the sky white and turning the air into something thick enough to choke on. He'd forgotten how brutal this country could be in daylight, how it sucked the moisture from your body and the hope from your soul. 5 years of searching had taken him through a lot of territory, but none quite as merciless as this stretch between Hala City and Siringo. Kit woke an hour later, her face creased from pressing against the rough canvas. She said nothing, just climbed down from the wagon and splashed water on her face from the canteen. When she caught him watching, she glared. Something you want to say? No, ma'am. Then stopped staring. Wasn't staring, was watching the horizon behind you. She turned to look where he'd been focused and froze. In the distance, maybe 2 miles back, a thin column of dust rose against the pale sky. Someone was following them. Apaches? She asked, her voice steady despite the tension that had entered her frame. Don't think so. Apaches wouldn't kick up that much dust. They'd come at us quiet-like. He squinted against the glare. More likely your friends from town decided to see us off proper. They're not my friends. Figure of speech, ma'am. Kit moved to the wagon and pulled out the shotgun, checking the loads with practiced efficiency. You think they're coming for us? I think men like that don't give up easy when there's something they want. The stranger thought about Turk and Billy, about the gleam in their eyes when they'd watched Kit leave town, about the bank money still hidden somewhere in Hala City, and the fact that he was the only one besides them who knew where it was. We should move, put some distance between us and whatever's coming. They broke camp quickly, dousing the fire and covering the traces of their presence as best they could. Kit drove the wagon with renewed urgency, and the stranger ranged ahead on his horse, scouting the trail and watching for signs of ambush. The land rose gradually as they traveled, moving from flat desert into broken country studded with rock formations that looked like the bones of ancient giants. The heat became oppressive, shimmering in waves off the stones and turning the air into liquid. The stranger's shirt clung to his back, soaked through with sweat, and he could see Kit struggling with the reins as the sun beat down mercilessly on her unprotected head. Around midday, they came to a place where water seeped from between 2 rocks, forming a small pool before disappearing back into the earth. The stranger signaled for Kit to stop, and they watered the horses while keeping watch on their back trail. The dust column had grown closer, maybe a mile now, maybe less. We need to talk, the stranger said, refilling his canteen. So talk. Those men following us. I rode with them for a week. They're not good people. Kit's laugh was harsh. You think I can't tell bad men when I see them? I worked in a dance hall for 5 years. I know exactly what kind of people they are. Then you know they won't just let us ride away. They want something. What? I don't have anything worth taking. The stranger hesitated, weighing how much to tell her, then decided she deserved the truth if she was going to die for it. Before we left Hala City, they were planning to rob the bank. The leader, Turk, he thinks I know where he hid some money. And the young one, Billy, he had eyes for you. Kit's face hardened. Of course he did. Men always do, right up until they find out what I am. Then the eyes turn mean. She checked the shotgun again, her movements sharp with anger. So what do you suggest? We can't outrun them in this wagon. No, ma'am, we can't. And we can't fight them off if there's more than 2 or 3. Probably not. So what then? You gonna ride back and give them what they want? Buy me some time to get to Siringo? The stranger met her gaze and saw the challenge there, the expectation of betrayal. She'd been disappointed so many times she'd learned to expect it as surely as sunrise. No, ma'am, I'm going to do what I said I'd do. Ride with you to Siringo. Even if it gets you killed? Been closer to dead before, didn't much care for it, but I survived it anyway. Something shifted in Kit's expression, not quite trust, but maybe the beginning of belief that trust might be possible. You're a strange man, Yellowlegs. Been called worse. They pressed on through the afternoon heat, and the dust column behind them kept pace like a patient predator. The stranger found himself thinking about choices and consequences, about the paths that had led both him and Kit to this particular moment, in this particular stretch of hell. Different wars, different wounds, but the same fundamental loneliness that came from being marked by violence and judged by people who'd never known real hardship. As the sun began its descent, they came to a place where the trail narrowed between two steep ridges. The stranger called a halt and studied the terrain with a tactical eye he'd hoped never to use again. This is a bad spot, he said. Perfect for an ambush. Kit pulled the wagon to a stop and looked around, seeing what he saw. The high ground on either side, the limited options for escape, the way the shadows were already gathering in the narrow passage. Can we go around? Not without adding 2 days to the journey, and that's if we don't get lost or run into Apaches. So we go through and hope they don't hit us here. That's about the size of it. Kit's jaw set in determination. Then let's get it over with. They moved forward slowly, the wagon wheels loud in the gathering silence. The stranger's every sense was on high alert, reading the rocks and shadows for signs of movement. His hand rested on his rifle, ready but not quite drawn. Behind them, the dust column had disappeared, which worried him more than if he could still see it. They were halfway through the narrow passage when the first shot rang out. The bullet struck the rock face beside the wagon, sending stone chips flying. Kit jerked on the reins, and the horses reared in panic. The stranger wheeled his mount, searching for the source of the gunfire, and spotted movement on the ridge to their right. "Get down!" he shouted, but Kit was already moving, diving for cover behind the wagon with the shotgun in her hands. More shots followed, kicking up dust around them. The stranger returned fire, aiming for the muzzle flashes rather than visible targets. His horse danced nervously beneath him, trained for war but spooked by the echoing gunfire in the narrow space. "I count 3, maybe 4, Kit called out. "Can you see them?" "2 on the right ridge, at least 1 on the left." The stranger fired again and was rewarded by a yelp of pain. "Make that one less on the right." "Yellowlegs!" Turk's voice boomed down from above, distorted by the rock walls. "You got something belongs to me. Come on out and we'll talk about it peaceful-like." "Don't much feel like talking right now, Turk," the stranger shouted back. "That's unfriendly. Real unfriendly, especially considering I taught you everything you know about surviving out here." "You didn't teach me nothing worth learning." Billy's younger voice joined in, sharp with anger. "You turned your back on us, Yellowlegs. On me. After everything we'd done for you." The stranger didn't bother responding to that. Instead, he used the cover of their shouting to move closer to the wagon, positioning himself between Kit and the worst of the gunfire. A bullet whined past his ear, close enough that he felt the displacement of air. "They're trying to pin us down," Kit said, her voice remarkably steady. "Keep us here until dark, then come at us from both sides." The stranger nodded, impressed despite the circumstances. "You've been in tight spots before. Dance hall in a frontier town, remember? Had to fight off drunk cowboys on a regular basis. You learn to think tactically, or you don't survive." She fired the shotgun at a shadow moving on the left ridge, and whoever it was ducked back behind cover. "How much ammunition you got?" "Enough for now. You?" "Same, but it won't last forever." They fell into a rhythm then, trading shots with their attackers while conserving ammunition as best they could. The sun continued its descent, and the shadows lengthened, making it harder to distinguish rock from human forms. The stranger knew Turk was right. Once darkness fell completely, they'd be trapped. "We need to move," he said during a lull in the firing. "Can you drive the wagon at full speed through the rest of this passage?" "In the dark? I'll likely break an axle or lose a wheel. Better than waiting here to die." Kit looked at the canvas-wrapped bundle in the back of the wagon, her face tight with emotion. Then she nodded. All right, but you better keep them busy while I get the horses moving. Yes, ma'am. The stranger laid down covering fire as Kit climbed onto the wagon seat and gathered the reins. The horses were already skittish from the gunfire, and it took all her strength to control them. On the ridges above, the outlaws realized what was happening and increased their rate of fire. Now! The stranger shouted. Kit cracked the reins hard, and the horses lunged forward. The wagon careened through the narrow passage, wheels bouncing over rocks and ruts. The stranger rode alongside, firing up at the ridges to keep the outlaws' heads down. A bullet caught his hat, spinning it from his head, but he didn't stop to retrieve it. Couldn't stop. Could only keep riding, keep shooting, keep Kit and that wagon moving forward. They burst out of the narrow passage into open ground just as the last light faded from the sky. Behind them, angry shouts echoed off the rock walls, followed by the sound of horses scrambling down the steep slopes. The pursuit wasn't over, just temporarily delayed. Kit drove the horses hard for another mile before the stranger called for her to slow down. They couldn't risk injuring the animals, not this far from anywhere. When they finally stopped, both of them were breathing hard, their nerves stretched to breaking. You lost your hat, Kit said, staring at him in the moonlight. The stranger's hand went to his bare head, feeling the ridges of scar tissue exposed to the night air for the first time in 5 years. He turned away instinctively, but Kit caught his arm. Let me see. No. I said let me see. Her voice was gentle but firm. You saved my life back there. Least I can do is look at you properly. He wanted to refuse, to pull away and hide in the darkness, but something in her tone stopped him. Maybe it was the lack of pity. Maybe it was the simple directness of her request. Or maybe he was just tired of hiding. Slowly, he turned back to face her. The moonlight revealed everything, the ridges of healed flesh where a bowie knife had carved deep, the patchwork of scars that covered his scalp and part of his forehead, the way his hair grew in uneven patterns around the worst of the damage. It was ugly. He knew it was ugly. Had avoided mirrors for 5 years because he couldn't stand to see what had been done to him. Kit looked at him for a long moment, her green eyes moving over his face and scalp. Then she reached out and touched one of the scars, her fingers light as breath against his skin. Who did this to you? Confederate soldier, Missouri, near the end of the war. He was drunk, angry, looking for someone to hurt. I was convenient. The words came easier than he'd expected. Tried to scalp me with a bowie knife. Got interrupted before he could finish the job. Did you find him? The man who did it? Not yet. But I will. Kit's hand dropped away and she stepped back. That's why you're really here, isn't it? You think he might be in Siringo? The stranger considered lying, then decided against it. Truth is, I don't know where he is. Been tracking him for 5 years, following rumors and whispers and half-remembered descriptions. Trail led me to Hala City, but I lost it there. He ran his hand over his scarred scalp, the gesture self-conscious now that the hat was gone. Riding with you to Siringo, it's not about revenge. It's about choosing something different for once. Different how? Different from spending every waking moment thinking about killing a man I don't even know anymore. Different from letting hate be the only thing that keeps me moving forward. He met her eyes. You asked why I'm really here. That's why. Because when I saw you in that street, holding that boy, looking like your whole world had just ended, I saw myself. Saw what revenge looks like when it finally catches up to you. Kit's face twisted with pain. I killed him. My own son. The only good thing in my miserable life, and I killed him. It was an accident. That doesn't bring him back? No, ma'am, it doesn't. But riding yourself to death with guilt won't bring him back either. Won't change what happened. Won't make the people in Hala City any less righteous in their judgment. The stranger's voice softened. All you can do is what you set out to do. Bury him next to his father. Give him that much dignity, at least. Kit turned away, her shoulders shaking with silent tears. The stranger wanted to comfort her but didn't know how. He'd spent 5 years avoiding human connection, avoiding anything that might make him vulnerable or slow him down or distract him from his purpose. He'd forgotten how to offer comfort, if he'd ever known in the first place. Instead, he went back to searching for his hat in the darkness, retracing their path until he found it caught in a creosote bush. The bullet hole through the crown let the moonlight through, a perfect circle that had missed his skull by inches. He stared at it for a moment, then put it back on. The scars were still there, still ugly, but somehow the burden of hiding them felt lighter now. When he returned to the wagon, Kit had composed herself. Her face was dry, her posture straight, though her eyes remained red-rimmed. She'd built a small fire and was boiling coffee, the familiar ritual of frontier survival. "We'll need to keep moving," she said without preamble. "Those men won't give up just because we got through the passage." "No, ma'am. But they'll be more careful now. No, we're not easy targets." "That won't stop them." "Probably not." They drank the coffee in silence, listening to the night sounds of the desert. The distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of wind through sage, the soft breathing of the horses. Somewhere out there, Turk and Billy were regrouping, planning their next move. And somewhere further out, Apaches watched and waited, reading the signs and deciding whether these white interlopers were worth the effort of killing. "Tell me about Siringo," the stranger said finally. "What was it like when you lived there?" Kit's face softened slightly at the memory. "It was rough, just a scatter of buildings around an old mission, but there were good people there trying to build something. My husband was one of them, James. He believed in the future, believed we could make a life in that harsh country." She stared into the fire. Then the Apaches came. They'd been peaceful enough, trading with us, keeping their distance. But something changed. A misunderstanding, or maybe just bad luck. They attacked one night, killed half the settlement. James died defending the mission. "And you stayed after that?" "For a while. Tried to make it work for the boys' sake. But the others, She paused, choosing her words carefully. "They blamed me. Said I'd brought bad luck to the settlement. Said the boy was cursed because he didn't have a proper father. Eventually I couldn't take the whispers anymore. Took what little money I'd saved and moved to Hala City, thinking maybe it would be better there. But it wasn't. No, it was worse. At least in Siringo, people were honest about their hatred. In Hala City, they hid it behind religion and respectability." Kit's voice turned bitter. "I took work at the dance hall because it was the only place that would hire me, and that just proved to everyone that they'd been right about me all along." The stranger understood more than she probably realized. Different circumstances, different wounds, but the same fundamental truth. Once you were marked as different, as damaged, as less than, people would find ways to keep you in that category no matter what you did. "The boy," he said carefully. "What was his name?" Kit's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "Emmett, after his father." She looked toward the wagon where the small body lay wrapped in canvas. "He was 8 years old, smart as a whip, kind despite everything. He used to tell me stories about when we'd leave Hala City, about the ranch we'd have somewhere far away where nobody knew us, where he could go to school and I could be respectable and we'd both be happy." "Sounds like a good dream." "It was just a dream. I should have known better than to believe in dreams." "Maybe," the stranger said, "or maybe dreams are all we got to keep us human." Kit looked at him then, really looked at him, and something passed between them in that moment. Recognition, perhaps. The acknowledgement that they were both survivors of wars that had never officially ended, both carrying wounds that would never fully heal, both searching for something they couldn't name but recognized in each other's eyes. The moment stretched, fragile and uncertain, until a sound in the darkness broke the spell. Both of them reached for their weapons instantly, years of survival instinct overriding any softer emotions. But it was only a horse, wandering loose with an empty saddle and blood on its flanks. One of the outlaws' mounts, injured in the escape through the passage. It limped toward their fire, drawn by the light and the presence of other horses, its eyes wide with pain and fear. The stranger caught the reins and examined the wound, a bullet graze, painful but not fatal. He cleaned it as best he could with water from the canteen while Kit watched. "That Billy's horse," she observed. "I remember seeing it in town." "Probably. Question is whether Billy's still alive or if the Apaches got him." "You hope they did?" The stranger considered the question honestly. "Part of me does, but mostly I just hope they stay away from us long enough to get you to Siringo." Kit smiled faintly. "Still not going to admit you're trying to help me?" "Just riding in the same direction, ma'am. That's all." "You keep telling yourself that, Yellowlegs." They doctored Billy's horse and added it to their small string. Another mount might mean the difference between life and death out here, regardless of how they'd acquired it. Then they took turns keeping watch through the night, one sleeping while the other scanned the darkness for threats. When dawn broke across the desert, it brought no relief from the heat or the tension that had settled over them like a shroud. The stranger's watch shift ended as the first light touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rust. Kit stirred in the wagon bed where she'd been sleeping, her hand instinctively reaching for the canvas bundle before her eyes fully opened. They ate a cold breakfast of hardtack and jerky, neither willing to take the time to build a fire. The stranger kept scanning the terrain behind them, looking for signs of pursuit. Nothing moved in the early morning stillness except a hawk circling high overhead, riding the thermals in lazy spirals. "How far to Siringo?" he asked, as Kit checked the wagon's axles and wheels. 2 days if we push hard, 3 if we're careful. She straightened, wiping sweat from her forehead. "The question is whether we'll make it at all." "We'll make it." "You sound awfully sure about something you can't possibly know." The stranger adjusted his hat, feeling the bullet hole in the crown. "Been in worse spots and survived. Figure the odds can't be worse than Shiloh or Antietam." Kit studied him quietly. "You've been carrying those battles a long time. Everybody who lived through the war carries them. Some just hide it better than others." "Is that what you think you're doing? Hiding?" He met her gaze. "I think we're both experts at hiding, ma'am. Just different things we're hiding from." She didn't argue with that. Instead, she climbed onto the wagon seat and gathered the reins. "Then let's keep moving before whatever we're hiding from catches up." They traveled through the morning as the temperature climbed steadily, turning the air thick and oppressive. The landscape had changed from flat desert to broken badlands, all twisted rock formations and narrow arroyos that could hide an army. The stranger rode ahead, picking out the safest path while keeping alert for ambush. Around midday, they came across a stagecoach overturned in a ravine, its cargo scattered across the rocks. The bodies of the driver and passengers had been stripped and left for the buzzards, their flesh already starting to decompose in the brutal heat. Apache work, by the look of it, though the attack had happened days earlier. Kit pulled the wagon to a stop and stared at the carnage, her face pale. "We should bury them." "No time, and digging in this rock would take hours we don't have." The stranger dismounted and moved among the wreckage, searching for anything useful. He found a cavalry saber, its blade still sharp despite the rust on the hilt, and a good wool blanket that had somehow escaped the looters' attention. "Best we can do is keep moving and hope we don't end up like them." "That's cold. That's survival. They're past caring what happens to their bodies. We're not." Kit's jaw tightened, but she nodded. She understood the brutal calculus of frontier survival, even if she didn't like it. They'd both learned early that sentiment was a luxury you couldn't afford when death rode this close. They pressed on, and the stranger found himself thinking about the question Kit had asked earlier. Was he hiding? 5 years ago, he would have said no, would have insisted he was hunting, pursuing justice, doing what needed to be done. But now, with the scars on his head exposed to the sun, and a woman who'd killed her own child riding beside him into almost certain death, the distinction between hunting and hiding seemed less clear. Maybe revenge was just another form of hiding, a way to avoid facing the fact that the war had broken something inside him that could never be fixed. A way to keep moving forward without having to figure out what moving forward actually meant when you had no home to return to and no future that didn't include violence. "You're thinking awfully hard over there," Kit called out. "Better watch where you're riding before your horse steps in a hole." "Yes, ma'am." "And stop calling me ma'am. Makes me feel old." "What should I call you then?" "Kit works fine. That's my name." "Kit," he repeated, testing the sound of it. "All right then. And you can call me—" He paused, realizing he'd been Yellowlegs for so long he'd almost forgotten he had another name. "Samuel. Sam, if you prefer." "Samuel," Kit smiled slightly. "Suits you better than Yellowlegs. More human-like. Not sure I deserve to be called human after some of the things I've done." "That makes 2 of us." They fell silent again, but it was a different quality of silence now. Less guarded, less hostile. The silence of 2 people who'd acknowledged they were in this together, for better or worse, until they reached Siringo or died trying. The afternoon brought new dangers. They entered a stretch of country where water was scarce, and the rock formations closed in on either side, creating natural corridors that funneled them in specific directions. The stranger didn't like it. Too many places for ambush, too few options for escape. But there was no going around. The alternate routes would add days to their journey and take them even deeper into Apache territory. As they navigated through one particularly narrow passage, the stranger spotted something that made his blood run cold. Scratched into the rock face were symbols he recognized from his time in the cavalry. Apache signs, marking this as their territory and warning intruders to turn back. "We need to move faster," he said, spurring his horse forward. Kit snapped the reins, and the horses responded despite their exhaustion. The wagon bounced over the rough ground, its wheels creaking in protest. Behind them, the stranger heard something that confirmed his fears, the distant sound of riders, multiple horses moving fast. "Company coming," he called to Kit. "And I don't think it's Turk and Billy this time." Kit's face set in grim determination. She drove the horses harder, one hand on the reins and the other reaching for the shotgun beside her. "How many?" "Can't tell yet, but enough to make this interesting." They burst out of the narrow passage into a wider valley, and the stranger immediately realized their mistake. They'd been herded here, pushed into this open ground where there was no cover and no escape. On the ridges surrounding the valley, figures appeared. Apache warriors on horseback, at least a dozen of them, maybe more. The stranger pulled his horse alongside the wagon. "Stop here, don't run. Running just makes them chase harder." "You want me to just sit here and wait for them to kill us?" "I want you to let me try talking first. I know some of their language from the war. Maybe we can negotiate." Kit's laugh was bitter. "You think they're going to negotiate with the people who destroyed their way of life? Who killed their families and stole their land? No. But I think they might be curious enough about why we're here to listen before they kill us." The Apache warriors rode down from the ridges in a coordinated movement that spoke of discipline and experience. They were magnificent to watch, warriors in their prime, faces painted for war, carrying rifles alongside traditional weapons. They circled the wagon slowly, studying the strangers with eyes that missed nothing. Their leader rode forward, a man perhaps 40 years old with a scar running down his left cheek and an expression that suggested he'd seen more than enough of white people to last several lifetimes. He spoke in Apache, the word sharp and demanding. The stranger responded haltingly in the same language, his pronunciation rough but comprehensible. He explained they were traveling to Siringo to bury a child, that they meant no harm, that they were merely passing through and would be gone within days. The Apache leader listened without expression. Then he rode closer and pulled back the canvas covering the small body in the wagon bed. He looked at Emmett's still form for a long moment, then spoke again, his tone slightly less hostile. "He says the boy's spirit will wander if he's not buried properly," the stranger translated for Kit. "Says this is bad medicine." "Tell him I know that," Kit said, her voice thick with emotion. "Tell him I'm taking my son to his father so they can be together." The stranger translated, and something shifted in the Apache leader's face. He nodded slowly, then turned and spoke to his warriors. A heated discussion followed, voices raised in argument. Some wanted to kill the intruders immediately. Others seemed to be advocating for mercy. Finally, the leader raised his hand for silence. He looked directly at the stranger and spoke, his words measured and deliberate. "What did he say?" Kit asked when the stranger didn't immediately translate. "He says they'll let us pass, but only if we promise never to return to this territory, and—" the stranger hesitated. "And if I give him my horse." "Your horse? That's how you'll get out of here after we reach Siringo." "Rather lose a horse than my scalp, and yours." He dismounted and led his horse to the Apache leader, handing over the reins with a slight bow of respect. The warrior accepted the gift, then did something unexpected. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a leather cord strung with beads and feathers. He handed it to the stranger and spoke again. "He says this is safe passage through his territory," the stranger translated, holding up the cord. "Says we're under his protection until we leave Apache lands." He paused. "Also says if we break our word in return, he'll personally hunt us down and stake us out for the ants." "Seems fair," Kit said dryly. The Apache warriors withdrew as smoothly as they'd appeared, fading back into the rocks and vanishing from sight. Within minutes, the valley was empty except for Kit, the stranger, and the wagon with its sad cargo. Kit let out a breath she'd been holding. You just saved our lives. Don't thank me yet. Now we're down to one horse and a wagon that's about to lose a wheel if I'm reading those cracks right. And we still have Turk and Billy somewhere behind us. Always looking on the bright side, aren't you, Samuel? Learned a long time ago that hoping for the best is a good way to end up dead. They continued through the afternoon, the stranger now riding Billy's injured horse while leading his own mount behind the wagon. The animal limped slightly, favoring its wounded flank, but it was steady enough. As evening approached, they made camp in a depression between two rocky hills, a place that offered some protection from the wind and minimal visibility from the surrounding terrain. Kit busied herself preparing a meager dinner while the stranger tended to the horses and checked their weapons. The shotgun still had plenty of shells, and he had maybe 30 rounds left for his rifle. Not much if they ran into serious trouble, but enough to make an attacker think twice. As they ate, Kit asked the question he'd been expecting. You speak Apache. How'd you learn that? Spent time in this territory during the war. Had an Apache scout attached to our unit for a while. He taught me some of the language in exchange for teaching him to read English. What happened to him? Same thing that happens to most people in a war. He died. The stranger poked at the small fire with a stick. Caught a bullet meant for me during a skirmish near the Mexican border. Never even knew what killed him. You carry a lot of dead men with you, Samuel. So do you. Kit nodded slowly. Yes, I suppose I do. She looked toward the wagon where Emmett lay. Sometimes I wake up and forget, just for a second. Forget that he's gone. Then I remember and it's like dying all over again. That's the worst part. The forgetting and remembering, like killing them again every single morning. Is that how it is with your scars? With the man who gave them to you? The stranger pulled off his hat and ran his hand over the ridged flesh, a gesture that was becoming less self-conscious with repetition. Used to be. Used to wake up every morning thinking about finding him, making him pay. But lately, he stopped, searching for the right words. Lately, I wonder what happens after. When I finally track him down and kill him, what then? What do I wake up thinking about when revenge is all used up? Maybe you think about living instead of just surviving. Maybe, if I remember how. Kit reached across the fire and touched his scarred hand with her own. It was a brief contact, nothing intimate or presumptuous, just one damaged person acknowledging another. But it sent a jolt through him nonetheless, a reminder that he was still capable of feeling something other than rage and emptiness. I think you're remembering, Kit said softly. Otherwise you wouldn't be here. Before he could respond, a sound in the darkness made them both reach for their weapons. The stranger motioned for Kit to stay low while he moved to the edge of their camp, rifle ready. He scanned the night, listening for anything that didn't belong. Footsteps, the click of a hammer being cocked, the soft jingle of spurs. I know you're out there, Turk, he called into the darkness. Might as well show yourself. Silence answered him. Then, from somewhere out in the night, Turk's voice drifted back. You got something that belongs to me, Yellow Legs, and I aim to get it back. Don't know what you're talking about. The bank money, you know where I hid it. Only two people in the world who know that, you and me. And I don't trust you to keep quiet about it. Then you've got a problem, because I'm not going back to Gila City, and I'm not telling you where anything is. That's what I figured you'd say. Turk's voice moved, circling their position. So here's how this is going to work. You're going to hand over that woman and ride back with me. Do that, and I'll let you live. Might even cut you in on the money. Not interested. You're making a mistake. That woman's cursed, can't you see? Killed her own kid. She'll bring you nothing but misery and death. The stranger glanced back at Kit, who sat rigid with anger and shame. Then I guess misery and death are what I'm choosing. Now get off our trail before I put a bullet through whatever passes for your brain. Turk's laughter echoed across the rocks. You always were stubborn. That's why I liked you. But stubbornness don't stop bullets, and I got plenty of those. The voice faded as he moved further away. See you in Siringo, Yellow Legs? Count on it. Then he was gone, melting back into the night like smoke. But his presence lingered, a threat hanging over them like storm clouds. He's not going to give up, Kit said. No, he's not. Why does he want me? The money I understand, but why does he keep talking about taking me? The stranger didn't want to answer, but he owed her honesty. Men like Turk, they don't see women as people. They see property, something to own and control and use. He probably figures having a woman like you would give him status, prove something to the other men. Kit's face hardened. A woman like me? You mean a whore? I mean a woman who's survived things that would have broken most people. A woman with strength and courage and a will that won't be bent. The stranger met her eyes. But men like Turk can't see that. They only see what they want to take. And what do you see, Samuel? He considered the question carefully. I see someone trying to do right by her son, even when it's impossible. Someone who refuses to let the world tell her who she is. Someone who's maybe not that different from me, just trying to find a way forward when all the old paths are closed. Kit's expression softened. That's the kindest thing anyone said to me in 5 years. It's just the truth. Truth isn't always kind. But thank you anyway. They kept watch in shifts through the night, neither sleeping deeply, both aware that Turk was out there somewhere planning his next move. When dawn came, they broke camp quickly and pushed on toward Siringo. The land grew increasingly desolate as they traveled. Vegetation became sparse, just tough desert plants clinging to life in the harsh soil. The heat intensified, reflecting off the rocks in waves that distorted vision and made breathing difficult. The stranger could see Kit wilting under the relentless sun, her face reddening despite the bonnet she wore. Around noon, as they navigated through a particularly difficult stretch of broken terrain, disaster struck. The wagon's right rear wheel hit a concealed rock, and they all heard the sharp crack of wood splintering. The wheel didn't break completely, but the damage was severe enough that continuing without repairs would be impossible. The stranger examined the wheel while Kit watched anxiously. Can you fix it? Maybe. I'll need to reinforce the spokes and pray it holds until we reach Siringo. He looked up at the merciless sun. But it's going to take time, hours probably. We don't have hours. Turks out there, and those Apaches might change their minds about letting us pass. Don't have much choice. We keep going on this wheel, it'll collapse completely. Then we'll really be stuck. Kit climbed down from the wagon and moved to stand in what little shade the vehicle provided. Then we'd better get started. They worked through the afternoon heat, the stranger using materials scavenged from the overturned stagecoach to reinforce the damaged wheel, while Kit kept watch with the shotgun. It was brutal work, made worse by the temperature and the knowledge that every minute they stayed in one place increased their vulnerability. As the stranger worked, he found himself thinking about choices again. He could have stayed in Hala City, could have robbed that bank with Turk and Billy, could have taken his share and moved on to the next town, the next lead, the next step in his endless pursuit of revenge. Instead, he was here in the middle of Apache territory, repairing a wagon wheel for a woman he barely knew so she could bury a child who wasn't his. It made no logical sense, but then again, nothing in his life had made logical sense since that night in Missouri when a drunk Confederate had tried to take his scalp. Maybe that was the point. Maybe survival in this harsh country required abandoning logic in favor of something more instinctual. The recognition of shared damage, the acknowledgement that some burdens were too heavy to carry alone. Tell me about Ohio, Kit said suddenly, breaking the silence. You said you were from there. What was it like? The stranger paused in his work, surprised by the question. Green, that's what I remember most. Everything was so green after the rain, trees everywhere, rivers that ran clear and cold, nothing like this desert. Sounds beautiful. It was. Before the war. He went back to reinforcing the wheel spoke. After, it didn't seem so beautiful anymore. Everything reminded me of what I'd lost, the friends who didn't come back, the life I'd expected to have. Got so I couldn't stand to be there anymore. Started riding west, kept riding until I ran out of west to ride to. And here you are. Here I am. Kit was quiet for a moment. You ever think about going back, starting over? Every day. But I don't know how to go back looking like this. Don't know how to explain the scars or the missing years or why I'm not the same person who left. Maybe you're not supposed to be the same person. Maybe that's the whole point of surviving. You come out changed, and you have to figure out what to do with whoever you've become. The stranger looked up at her. This woman who'd lost everything but refused to stop moving forward. When did you get so wise? When I killed my son and had to figure out whether to lie down and die or keep going. Turns out, even when you want to die, the body keeps breathing. Might as well point it in some direction and see where it goes. He finished the repair work as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The wheel wasn't perfect, but it would hold if they were careful. They loaded up and started moving again, slower now, nursing the damaged wagon over the rough terrain. As darkness fell, they saw lights in the distance, faint and scattered, but unmistakably human. Siringo, or what was left of it. "We're almost there," Kit said, her voice barely above a whisper. The stranger nodded, feeling a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. They'd made it through Apache territory, through Turks' harassment, through heat and exhaustion and the weight of everything they carried. But arriving at Siringo meant confronting the reality of what they'd come to do. It meant burying a child and saying goodbye to whatever fragile connection had formed between them on this desperate journey. It meant facing the question of what came after. They made camp one last time, just outside the ruins of the settlement. Too tired to go further, too close to stop now. The stranger built a fire while Kit sat staring at the distant lights, her face unreadable. "I'm scared," she said finally. "Of what?" "Of getting there. Of it being real. As long as we were traveling, I could tell myself we were still in it together, still fighting to reach something. But once we arrive, once Emmett's buried," her voice broke. "Then I'm alone again. And I don't know if I can stand that." The stranger moved to sit beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "You're not alone. You'll leave. Go back to hunting the man who scarred you. Back to your revenge. Maybe. Or maybe I've learned that revenge is a poor substitute for living." He looked at her profile in the firelight. "Maybe I've found something worth staying for." Kit turned to face him, her green eyes searching his scarred face. "Don't say that unless you mean it, Samuel. Don't give me hope just to take it away." "I mean it." She studied him for a long moment, then leaned her head against his shoulder. They sat like that in the darkness, two broken people finding comfort in shared survival, while the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. Tomorrow, they would reach Siringo. Tomorrow, there would be goodbyes and graves and the future to figure out. But tonight, for just a few hours, they allowed themselves to simply be, not running from the past or racing toward revenge, but present in this moment, alive despite everything, together against the dark. The morning brought a clarity that felt almost cruel. Siringo lay spread before them in the pale dawn light, a collection of crumbling adobe buildings clustered around the skeletal remains of an old mission. The walls stood like broken teeth against the sky, and the settlement that Kit had described was now little more than a ghost town surrendering slowly to the desert. Kit stared at the ruins without speaking, her hands gripping the wagon reins so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The stranger watched her face and saw the memories flickering there, of her husband alive and hopeful, of a life that might have been, of the violent night when everything changed. "It's worse than I remembered," she said finally. "Or maybe I just wanted to remember it different. Memory does that, makes things better or worse than they were, depending on what we need them to be." Kit nodded slowly, then snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward, the damaged wheel groaning in protest. They moved down the slope toward what had once been Siringo's main street, passing buildings with caved-in roofs and doorways that opened onto empty darkness. The few structures still intact showed signs of recent habitation: a corral with 2 horses, smoke rising from a chimney, laundry hanging on a line. Someone had stayed behind or returned after the others fled. The stranger's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle as they passed, alert for any threat. A figure emerged from one of the buildings, an old Mexican man with a weathered face and cautious eyes. He watched them approach without speaking, his posture suggesting he'd seen enough strangers to be wary of them all. "Buenos dias," the stranger called out in passable Spanish. The old man nodded but said nothing, his gaze moving from the stranger to Kit to the canvas-wrapped bundle in the wagon bed. Understanding flickered across his face, and some of the wariness faded. "Estamos buscando el cementerio," Kit said, her Spanish rougher than the stranger's, but serviceable. "We're looking for the cemetery." The old man pointed toward the mission, then spoke rapidly in Spanish. "The cemetery was behind the ruins," he said. "There hadn't been any new burials in over a year, not since the last of the settlers fled." He asked if they needed help, if they required a priest. Kit shook her head. No priest. Just a place to bury her son next to his father. The old man's expression softened with sympathy. He crossed himself and spoke a quiet blessing, then pointed again toward the mission before retreating back into his dwelling. The stranger got the sense the man had learned long ago not to involve himself too deeply in other people's sorrows. Survival in places like this required a certain hardness, a willingness to witness suffering without letting it consume you. They drove the wagon around the mission's crumbling walls to where the cemetery sprawled across a windswept piece of ground. Wooden crosses and stone markers tilted at drunken angles, many of them illegible from weathering and neglect. Weeds grew thick between the graves, and the stranger could see where animals had dug into some of the older burial sites. Kit climbed down from the wagon with movements that seemed to cost her everything. She stood staring at the cemetery, her face pale beneath the dust and sun damage. I don't know if I can find it. James's grave. It's been so long. We'll look together. They moved among the graves slowly, reading what names remained visible on the markers. Most were Spanish, dating back to when the mission had been active. Others were more recent, American names from the settlement's brief existence. Here lay a woman who died in childbirth. There, a child taken by fever. Beyond them, a man killed by Apaches, his marker noting the date, but not the circumstances. Kit stopped suddenly before a simple wooden cross weathered almost white by the elements. The name carved into the crosspiece was barely legible, but she traced the letters with her fingers as if reading Braille. "James Tilden," she whispered. "This is him. This is where he is." The stranger stood back, giving her space for whatever she needed to feel or say. Kit knelt in the dust beside her husband's grave, her hand pressed against the earth as if she could somehow reach through soil and time to touch the man she'd lost. "I tried, James," she said softly. "I tried to protect him, tried to give him the life you wanted for him. But I failed. I failed you both." Tears tracked through the dust on her face, and she made no attempt to wipe them away. "I'm bringing him home now. At least I can do that much. At least they can be together." The stranger turned away, pretending to study the mission walls to give her privacy. His throat felt tight with emotions he'd kept locked away for too long. Grief wasn't just Kit's burden. It was a weight they all carried, everyone who'd survived the war and its aftermath, everyone who'd lost people they loved and had to keep living anyway. After several minutes, Kit stood and returned to the wagon. Her tears had stopped, replaced by that familiar mask of determination. "I need a shovel, and I need to know you'll help me dig. Already figured I would. Even though you've got no obligation? Even though this isn't your sorrow to carry?" The stranger looked at her, this woman who'd somehow become more than a stranger on a desperate journey. "Maybe that's exactly why. Because it's not my sorrow, but I choose to carry some of it anyway. Same way you didn't have to sit with me by the fire that night, didn't have to listen when I talked about Ohio. We choose what we carry for each other. That's what makes us human, instead of just survivors." Kit's eyes shimmered with fresh tears, but she blinked them back. "You're a good man, Samuel. Better than you think you are." "Don't be so sure about that." They found tools in the wagon, a shovel with a worn handle and a pickaxe for breaking through the rocky soil. The work was brutal in the mounting heat, made worse by exhaustion and the emotional weight of what they were doing. They took turns digging beside James Tilden's grave, breaking through the hardpan and removing rocks that seemed determined to protect the dead from any further intrusion. The stranger's shirt was soaked through with sweat within the first hour, and Kit's face had gone from pale to dangerously flushed. They shared water from the canteen, rationing it carefully, neither speaking much beyond the practical necessities of the work. As the hole deepened, the stranger's mind wandered to graves he'd dug during the war. Mass graves after battles, hasty burials before retreating from enemy advances, lonely holes scraped in frozen ground for men whose names he never learned. He'd thought he was done with grave digging, thought he'd left that particular horror behind when the war ended. But maybe you never really left the war behind. Maybe it followed you in everything you did, in the way you slept with one eye open, in the way you measured distances and counted ammunition without thinking, in the way you understood that death was always close and life was just the space between burials. By early afternoon, the grave was deep enough. They stopped to rest in the shade of the mission wall, both of them too exhausted for conversation. The stranger noticed that Kit kept glancing toward the cemetery, her expression troubled. "Having second thoughts?" he asked. "No, just thinking about what comes after. After we lower him into the ground and cover him up and say whatever words need saying. What happens then? Then we figure out what to do next. Is there a we? Or do you go your way and I go mine?" It was the question that had been hovering between them since the previous night. The stranger considered his answer carefully, knowing that what he said now would shape whatever future remained for both of them. "I don't know," he admitted. "I spent 5 years thinking I knew exactly what I was doing and where I was going. Now I'm not sure about anything except that I don't want to go back to how things were before. Don't want to spend another 5 years chasing ghosts and calling it purpose." "Then what do you want?" "Honestly, I want to see what happens if I stop running, stop hiding behind revenge, and actually try to live." He met her gaze. "But that's easier said than done, and it might not work. I might wake up tomorrow and feel that old rage coming back, telling me I've got unfinished business." Kit nodded slowly. "At least you're honest about it. That's more than most men would be." They returned to the wagon and carefully lifted Emmett's canvas-wrapped body. The boy was small, his weight almost nothing, but carrying him to the grave felt like carrying the world. Kit held his head, the stranger his feet, and they moved with the solemn care of pallbearers at a state funeral. When they reached the grave, Kit hesitated. "I don't know if I can let go." "Take your time." She stood there holding her son's body, her face working through a dozen different emotions. Finally, she bent and pressed her forehead against the canvas, whispering something too quiet for the stranger to hear. Then, with movements that looked like they might break her, she helped lower Emmett into the earth. The boy's small form settled at the bottom of the grave, wrapped in canvas that would eventually rot away and return him to the soil. Kit knelt at the edge, staring down, and for a long moment the stranger thought she might throw herself in after him. "Kit," he said gently, "it's time." "I know." But she didn't move. "You did right by him. Brought him home like you promised. That's more than most would do." "It's not enough. It'll never be enough." "No. But it's what we've got." Slowly Kit stood and took the shovel from his hands. She threw the first pile of dirt into the grave herself, the soil pattering against the canvas with a sound that made them both flinch. Then she handed the shovel back to the stranger, unable to continue. He finished the work while she watched, each shovelful of earth covering her son a little more, until finally the grave was full and mounded over. They placed stones on top to keep animals from digging, then fashioned a simple cross from pieces of wood salvaged from the ruins. Kit produced a knife and carved into the crosspiece with shaking hands. "Emmett James Tilden," she said as she worked, "born in sorrow, died in mercy, forever with his father." When the marker was in place, they stood together in the cemetery silence. A hot wind blew across the graves, stirring the dust and making the wooden crosses creak on their posts. Somewhere in the ruins, a bird called out, its cry echoing off the adobe walls. "Is there supposed to be words?" Kit asked. "Some kind of prayer or blessing?" "I don't know. Never been much for religion." "Me neither. But it seems like there should be something." The stranger thought about all the graves he'd stood beside, all the bodies he'd buried with nothing but exhaustion and the need to keep moving. "Maybe just say what's in your heart. That's probably more honest than any prayer." Kit was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion but steady. "You were the best thing in my life, Emmett. The only purely good thing I ever made. You deserved so much better than what I could give you, better than dying in the street because your mother was too stupid and scared to be careful with a gun." She paused, tears streaming freely now. "I hope wherever you are, it's better than here. I hope you're with your daddy, and I hope you can forgive me someday. I'll carry you with me every day for the rest of my life. That's my promise to you." The stranger found himself with tears in his own eyes, moved by the raw honesty of her words. He'd heard plenty of battlefield prayers and funeral orations during the war, but none had carried the weight of truth that Kit's simple goodbye held. They stood there until the sun began its descent toward evening, neither wanting to leave, neither able to stay. Finally, Kit turned away from the grave and walked back toward the wagon without looking back. The stranger followed, understanding that sometimes the only way to say goodbye was to simply walk away. As they reached the wagon, a voice called out from the ruins. "That was real touching. Brought a tear to my eye, it did." The stranger spun, his hand going to his gun, and saw Turk step out from behind the mission wall. Billy emerged from a different direction, flanking them. Both men had their weapons drawn and the look of people who'd been waiting patiently for the right moment. "Told you I'd see you in Siringo," Turk said with his tobacco-stained grin. "You didn't think I'd let you slip away after coming all this distance, did you?" "What do you want, Turk?" "Same thing I wanted back in Hala City, the location of that bank money, and the woman." His eyes moved to Kit with an expression that made the stranger's skin crawl. "Though I'll admit, watching her bury her bastard kid has made me more interested. Woman with that much grief in her ought to be grateful for some comfort." Kit's face hardened. "I'd rather die." "That can be arranged," Billy said, his young voice trying for menace and almost achieving it. "But it'd be a waste. Pretty woman like you, out here all alone, you need a man to take care of you." "I've got a man," Kit said, moving closer to the stranger. Billy laughed. "You mean Yellow Legs? He can't even take his hat off without scaring children. What kind of man is that?" The stranger felt the old rage rising, the fury he'd carried for 5 years threatening to break through his carefully maintained control. His hand tightened on his rifle, calculating angles and distances, figuring odds. "Don't do it, Yellow Legs," Turk said, reading his intention. "You might get one of us, but the other will kill that woman before you can turn around. Now, let's all be civilized about this. Put down your weapons, and we'll talk." "We've got nothing to talk about." "Sure we do. See, I've been thinking about my plans for an army, for taking over this territory and setting up my own little kingdom. And I realized I need men I can trust, men with military experience." Turk's grin widened. "You served in the cavalry. You know how to train soldiers, how to fight Apaches, how to survive in this country. Join up with me and Billy, tell me where that bank money is, and I'll make it worth your while. We'll even let the woman come along if you want her that bad." "And if I refuse?" "Then Billy puts a bullet in her brain, and we torture the information out of you before we kill you too. Your choice. But make it quick. I'm getting tired of standing in this heat." The stranger looked at Kit, saw the fear in her eyes mixed with determination. She wasn't going to beg or plead or try to bargain. She'd faced death before, and would face it again with the same defiant strength that had carried her this far. But he hadn't come all this way, hadn't helped her bury her son and shared her grief, just to watch Turk put a bullet in her. Hadn't started remembering what it felt like to care about something beyond revenge just to have it ripped away. "All right," he said slowly, lowering his rifle. "I'll tell you where the money is." "Samuel, no." Kit started to protest, but he cut her off with a look. "It's buried behind the saloon in Hala City," the stranger said. 3 feet down, marked with a rock that's got a chip out of the left side. That's where Turk hid it before we left town." Turk's grin faltered slightly. "How'd you know about that?" "Because I watched you bury it. Followed you that night when you thought everyone was asleep. Figured knowledge like that might come in handy someday." "You sneaky son of a—" Turk started forward, then stopped, suspicion replacing anger. "You're lying, trying to buy time. Check for yourself, but that means riding back to Hala City, and by the time you get there and dig up the money, we'll be long gone." Billy shifted nervously. "Turk, maybe we should—" "Shut up. I'm thinking." Turk studied the stranger with narrowed eyes, trying to read truth from deception. "You're coming with us, both of you. We'll ride back together, and if that money's where you say it is, maybe I'll let you live." "Maybe." "That wasn't the deal." "I'm changing the deal. Billy, get their weapons." The young man moved forward cautiously, keeping his gun trained on Kit. He reached for the stranger's rifle, and in that moment of distraction, everything changed. An arrow punched through Billy's chest from behind, the stone point emerging bloody from his sternum. He staggered, eyes wide with shock, then collapsed. Behind him stood the Apache leader from the previous day, bow in hand, with a dozen warriors fanning out from the ruins. Turk spun, firing wildly, but Apache bullets and arrows cut him down before he managed 3 shots. He fell in the dust of Siringo's main street, his dreams of empire dying with him, blood pooling beneath his body and soaking into the thirsty ground. The Apache leader walked forward and looked down at the dead outlaws with an expression of satisfaction. Then he turned to the stranger and spoke in his own language, gesturing at the bodies. "What's he saying?" Kit asked, her voice shaky with adrenaline. "He says these men were following us, breaking the terms of safe passage. He says his warriors have been watching over us since yesterday, making sure we kept our word about leaving his territory." The stranger bowed his head in thanks, and the Apache leader returned the gesture. "He says we have until sundown to bury our dead and leave. After that, the protection ends." The Apache warriors faded back into the ruins as silently as they'd appeared, leaving the stranger and Kit alone with two fresh corpses and the fading light of afternoon. Kit let out a long, shaking breath. "I thought we were dead." "So did I. Those men, the Apaches, they saved us. They were honoring their word. They gave us safe passage, and they made sure nobody interfered with it." The stranger looked at the bodies of Turk and Billy. "Question now is what we do with these two. Leave them for the buzzards. They don't deserve burial." The stranger understood the sentiment, but something in him resisted. Maybe it was his military training. Maybe it was simple human decency. Maybe it was just exhaustion with death and violence and the endless cycle of revenge. They were bad men, but they were still men. "We'll dig shallow graves, quick ones, just enough to cover them and mark the spot." Kit looked like she wanted to argue but didn't have the energy. "You're too good for this world, Samuel. You know that?" "No, I'm just trying to be better than I was." They dug 2 shallow graves as the sun descended, working quickly despite their exhaustion. When the bodies were covered and marked with simple stones, the stranger stood and looked around at Siringo, at the ruined mission, at the cemetery with its tilted crosses, at the few remaining buildings surrendering to entropy. "This place is dying," he said. "Maybe already dead. Nothing here but ghosts and memories." Kit nodded. "That's all it ever was, really. People trying to build something permanent in a place that doesn't want permanence. The desert takes everything back eventually." "So what now? Where do you go from here?" She was quiet for a long moment, her green eyes studying his scarred face in the fading light. "I was thinking maybe I'd head west. California, perhaps. Start over where nobody knows me or what I've done. Find some little town where I can be just another woman trying to make a life." She paused. "But I wouldn't mind company for the journey, if you were inclined to join me." The stranger felt something shift in his chest, some frozen part of his heart cracking open. For 5 years he'd been moving with single-minded purpose toward revenge, never looking left or right, never considering any path except the one that led to the man who'd scarred him. Now Kit was offering a different path, one that led away from the past instead of endlessly circling it. "California's a long way," he said carefully. "It is. And there's no guarantee things would work out. We barely know each other. Might be we'd get 100 miles down the trail and realize we can't stand each other's company." "That's true. And I've still got scars, still got rage in me that might come out at the wrong times, still got nightmares that wake me up screaming. I'm not whole, Kit. Don't know if I'll ever be whole again." Kit moved closer and took his scarred hand in both of hers. "Nobody's whole, Samuel. We're all broken in different ways. The question isn't whether we're perfect enough to deserve happiness. The question is whether we're brave enough to reach for it anyway, knowing it might not last, knowing we might fail." She looked up at him. "I killed my son. I'll never forgive myself for that. But I'm still here, still breathing, still capable of wanting things. Maybe even capable of loving someone again, if I find someone worth loving." "And you think I might be worth loving?" "I think you rode into Apache territory to help a stranger bury her child. I think you gave up revenge to choose something better. I think you're exactly the kind of man worth loving, scarred and damaged and doing your best anyway." She squeezed his hand. "But I'm not asking you to love me. Not yet. I'm just asking if you want to ride west together and see what happens." The stranger thought about Ohio and all the places he'd been since leaving it, thought about the trail he'd followed for 5 years and the man at the end of it who didn't matter nearly as much as he once had. Thought about choices and consequences and the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he could choose something other than rage and revenge. "All right," he said finally. "California sounds fine." Kit's smile transformed her face, erasing years of hardness and grief. "Fine? That's all you've got to say? Fine? What else do you want? A speech?" Maybe a kiss would be nice. The stranger felt his face heat beneath the scars. I'm not much for kissing. Not with a face like this. Then it's a good thing I'm not looking at your face. I'm looking at your heart. Kit stood on her toes and pressed her lips gently against his, a brief contact that carried more promise than passion. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright. There. That wasn't so terrible, was it? No, ma'am. Wasn't terrible at all. They loaded up the wagon as twilight settled over Saringo, working together with the easy coordination of people who'd learned to trust each other through shared hardship. The stranger checked the damaged wheel one last time, reinforcing it as best he could for the journey ahead. As they prepared to leave, Kit walked back to Emmett's grave one final time. She stood there with her hand on the wooden cross, saying a silent goodbye. The stranger waited by the wagon, giving her the privacy she needed. When she returned, her face was calm, almost peaceful. I'm ready now. You sure? As sure as I'll ever be. The dead don't need us hovering over them. They're at rest. It's the living who need to keep moving. They climbed onto the wagon seat together, Kit taking the reins while the stranger settled in beside her with his rifle across his knees. The horses started forward, pulling them away from Saringo and toward whatever future waited beyond the horizon. Behind them, the settlement faded into the gathering dark. Just another ghost town in a territory full of them. Just another place where people had dreamed of building something lasting and learned the hard way that nothing lasts forever except the land itself. But ahead, to the west, the sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, beautiful despite everything. And for the first time in 5 years, the stranger found himself looking forward instead of back, riding towards something instead of away from it. The hat with its bullet hole still sat on his head, but it felt lighter now. The scars beneath it would never heal completely, but maybe they didn't have to. Maybe carrying scars just meant you'd survived something worth surviving. Maybe being damaged just meant you'd lived long enough to accumulate damage. What are you thinking about? Kit asked as they rolled across the darkening desert. I'm thinking that I don't know your real name. You know mine, Samuel, but I've just been calling you Kit. She smiled. Catherine Ann Tilden, though Kit's what most people call me. Catherine, he repeated, testing the sound of it. Suits you. You think so? I do. It's got strength to it, same as you. They rode in comfortable silence after that, the wagon creaking beneath them, the stars beginning to emerge overhead. Tomorrow they'd figure out the practical details, which route to take, how to get supplies, whether to try joining a wagon train or traveling alone. Tomorrow, there would be challenges and obstacles and the everyday difficulties of frontier survival. But tonight, for just a few hours, they allowed themselves to simply be two people riding west together, carried by hope instead of driven by revenge, choosing life over death and possibility over certainty. And if that wasn't redemption, it was at least a start. The stars wheeled overhead as they put distance between themselves and Saringo, the wagon rolling across terrain that grew gradually less hostile as they moved west. The stranger, Samuel, he reminded himself, he had a name again, kept watch on their back trail out of habit. But for the first time in 5 years, he wasn't looking for someone specific, just watching, just being cautious. The difference felt significant. Catherine dozed beside him on the wagon seat, her head occasionally dipping toward his shoulder before she jerked awake again. Exhaustion had finally caught up with her now that the immediate purpose that had driven her was fulfilled. Her son was buried beside his father, the promise kept, the debt paid. What remained was simply survival, and survival could wait until morning. Around midnight, Samuel guided the wagon into a sheltered spot between two rock formations and called a halt. Catherine woke fully as the wheels stopped moving, blinking in confusion before memory returned. How long was I asleep? Couple hours. We've made good distance. Should be clear of Apache territory by morning if we push on at first light. They made camp without building a fire, both too tired to bother and too cautious to advertise their position. Samuel unhitched the horses and rubbed them down while Catherine spread blankets in the wagon bed. The night air had turned cold, as desert nights always did, and their breath misted in the starlight. Samuel, Catherine called softly from the wagon, there's room for two in here if you don't mind close quarters. He hesitated, old habits and newer uncertainties warring in his chest, But the night was cold and the ground was hard, and the woman was offering comfort he hadn't allowed himself to want in 5 years. "That'd be fine," he said, climbing into the wagon bed beside her. They lay side by side under the blankets, not touching, but aware of each other's presence in every breath and shift of position. Samuel stared up at the canvas covering above them and listened to Catherine breathing, trying to remember the last time he'd been this close to another human being without violence being involved. "Tell me something," Catherine said into the darkness. "The man who scarred you, the one you've been hunting all these years, do you even remember what he looked like?" Samuel considered the question honestly. "Not really. It was dark, and he was drunk, and I was more concerned with trying not to die than memorizing his face. I remember he had a scar on his left hand, shaped like a crescent. I remember the smell of whiskey. I remember him laughing while he cut me." He paused. "But his face, I couldn't pick him out of a crowd if my life depended on it." "Then how were you planning to find him?" "By asking questions. Following rumors of a Confederate soldier with a crescent scar who liked using a Bowie knife. It was never much of a plan, truth be told. More like something to do instead of admitting I had nothing to do." Catherine shifted closer, her shoulder touching his. "And now?" "Now I'm thinking that 5 years is long enough to carry that kind of hate. Thinking maybe it's time to let it go and see what's left of me when I do." "You scared of what you'll find?" "Terrified," he admitted. "Revenge gave me purpose. Without it, I'm just a scarred man with no home and no prospects, riding west with a woman I barely know toward a future that might not exist." Catherine's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers threading through his. "That makes 2 of us then, scared and scarred and riding toward maybe nothing, but at least we're doing it together." Samuel squeezed her hand gently. "At least we've got that." They fell asleep like that, hands clasped, 2 damaged people finding comfort in shared vulnerability. Samuel's dreams were troubled as always. Flashes of war, the sensation of a blade against his scalp, the faces of men he'd killed and men he'd failed to save. But when he woke to Catherine shaking his shoulder gently, calling his name, the dreams faded faster than they usually did. "You were making sounds," she said. "Bad dreams?" "Always, but they're getting quieter." "That's something, at least." They broke camp as the sun rose, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The damaged wagon wheel had held through the night, and Samuel spent a few minutes reinforcing it further before they set out. As they traveled, Catherine asked questions about California, about what they might find there, about how they'd survived the journey. Samuel answered as honestly as he could, which meant admitting he didn't know much. He'd never been to California, had only heard stories from other drifters and soldiers. Land of opportunity, they said. Gold in the mountains and fertile valleys and towns springing up faster than you could count them. Whether any of it was true remained to be seen. "We'll need money," Catherine said practically. "Once we reach the next settlement, we'll have to find work of some kind. I can scout for the army if they're hiring, or work as a ranch hand. I'm decent with horses. And I can—" Catherine stopped, her face tightening. "I can do what I've always done, I suppose. Dance hall work. It's the only skill I have that pays." Samuel heard the shame in her voice and understood it, but he also heard the resignation, the acceptance that survival sometimes meant doing things you weren't proud of. "Maybe we find something different. Maybe we try something new." "Like what?" "I can read and write passably, but that's about it. And you've got military skills in a country that's trying to forget there ever was a war." She shook her head. "I'm being practical, Samuel. We need to eat. Need supplies. Dancing for drunk cowboys isn't noble, but it's honest work in its own way. I'm not judging you. Everybody judges. That's what people do. They look at women like me and make assumptions, decide what we're worth, put us in categories that are hard to climb out of." Samuel thought about his own scars, about the assumptions people made when they saw his damaged face. People judge scars too, judge the men who carry them, decide we're monsters or victims, or broken things that can't be fixed. I understand more than you think I do. Catherine looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "I suppose you do. I suppose that's why we fit together, both of us marked by things we can't change, both of us trying to figure out how to live with it." They traveled through the morning without incident, putting more miles between themselves and Siringo. The landscape gradually shifted from harsh desert to slightly less harsh scrubland, with more vegetation and occasional signs of water. They passed a dried creek bed that showed evidence of recent flow, and Samuel made note of it for future reference. Water meant life out here, meant the difference between making it to the next settlement and dying of thirst in the emptiness. Around noon, they spotted another wagon in the distance, moving parallel to their course. Samuel's hand went instinctively to his rifle, but as they drew closer, he could see it was a family, a man and woman with several children, their wagon loaded with household goods and farming equipment. The other wagon altered course to intercept them, and Samuel tensed. But the man who hailed them seemed friendly enough, weathered and tired but not threatening. His wife looked exhausted, and the children ranged from toddlers to teenagers, all of them showing the strain of hard travel. "Name's Horace Brennan," the man called out. "We're heading to California, hoping to stake a homestead claim. You folks going that direction?" "We are," Samuel replied cautiously. "Well, if you're amenable, we could travel together for a spell. Safety in numbers, especially with Apaches and outlaws on the trails these days." Horace gestured to his family. "Got my wife Martha here, and our young ones. Could use another gun if trouble comes calling, and I imagine you could use the company." Samuel glanced at Catherine, who gave a small nod. Traveling with a family would provide protection and possibly respectability. People were less likely to ask uncomfortable questions or make unwelcome assumptions about a couple traveling with children and homesteaders. "That'd be agreeable," Samuel said. "We'll pull up alongside." They spent the afternoon traveling in convoy, the two wagons moving west together while the Brennan children ran between them with the boundless energy of youth. The oldest boy, maybe 14, peppered Samuel with questions about the war and fighting and whether he'd ever killed anyone. Samuel answered carefully, trying to discourage the romanticization of violence while not crushing the boy's enthusiasm entirely. Martha Brennan proved more perceptive than her husband. She studied Catherine with the sharp eye of a woman who'd learned to read people. But whatever conclusions she reached, she kept to herself. When they stopped to water the horses at a spring, Martha approached Catherine and offered her a sunbonnet. "You're burning something fierce," Martha said. "This'll help protect your face." Catherine accepted the gift with surprise. "Thank you, but I don't have anything to trade for it." "Don't need a trade, just being neighborly." Martha paused, choosing her words carefully. "I don't know your story, and I don't need to. But I can see you've had a hard road. If you need woman talk or just someone to sit with, I'm available." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. She blinked back quickly. "That's kind of you." "Kindness costs nothing, and we've got precious little else to share out here." That evening they made camp together, the two families sharing a fire and a meal of beans and hardtack. The Brennan children performed an impromptu concert of sorts, the older ones singing while the younger ones banged on pots and pans. It was chaos and noise, and completely overwhelming for Samuel, who hadn't been around children since before the war. But it was also strangely wonderful, a reminder that life continued, that people built futures even in harsh country, that hope persisted despite everything. Catherine sat beside him, her face soft in the firelight as she watched the children play. Samuel knew she was thinking of Emmett, of the son she'd lost and the future that had died with him. But there was something else in her expression too. Not quite happiness, but maybe the memory of what happiness felt like, the possibility that she might feel it again someday. After the children were bedded down and the adults sat around the dying fire, Horace told stories of California and the land they'd claimed there. Rich soil, he said, plenty of water, room for a man to build something lasting. Samuel listened and wanted to believe it, wanted to imagine a future where he and Catherine might do the same, find a piece of land, build a house, plant crops, live quietly without violence or judgment or the ghosts of the past. But he'd learned not to trust in futures too much, had learned that hope was dangerous, that planning too far ahead just gave fate more opportunities to laugh at you. Better to focus on the next day, the next mile, the next moment of not being dead. "You're awful quiet," Horace observed. "Not much of a talker?" "Just listening," Samuel replied. "Figuring things out." "What's to figure? You're heading west with your woman, looking for a fresh start. Same as us." Samuel glanced at Catherine, who was helping Martha clean the dinner pots. "She's not my woman, not exactly. We're just traveling together." Horace raised an eyebrow. "Could have fooled me. The way you two look at each other, The way you move together like you've known each other for years instead of, what, weeks? Days? He chuckled. Mark my words, friend. You'll be married before you hit California. Might as well accept it now and save yourself the struggle. It's complicated. Everything's complicated. That's life. But sometimes the complicated things are worth the struggle. Horace stood and stretched. I'm turning in. We'll push hard tomorrow. Try to make the trading post at Carson's Bend by evening. They'll have supplies we need, and you can probably find work there if you're looking. After Horace retired to his wagon, Catherine came and sat beside Samuel again. What were you two talking about? The future. Or the idea of one, anyway. And what did you decide? That I don't know anything about the future except that I want you in it. Catherine smiled and leaned her head against his shoulder. That's the sweetest thing you've said yet, Samuel. You're getting better at this. At what? At being human instead of just surviving. They sat together watching the fire burn down to embers, listening to the night sounds of the desert and the soft breathing of sleeping children. Somewhere out there, the man with the crescent scar might still be alive, might still be carrying on with his life, might never face justice for what he'd done. Somewhere out there, people were still fighting and dying and hurting each other for reasons both profound and petty. But here, in this moment, Samuel felt something he'd thought he'd lost forever: peace. Not perfect peace, not the absence of pain or memory or regret, just the simple peace of sitting beside someone who knew what he was and didn't flinch from it, of moving toward something instead of running from something, of choosing life over death one breath at a time. They reached Carson's Bend the following evening, a rough settlement built around a trading post where 3 trails converged. It wasn't much, maybe 20 buildings total, half of them tents, but it had supplies and people and the comforting smell of civilization struggling against the wilderness. The trading post owner, a grizzled man named Carson, who'd given the place its name, looked them over with the assessing eye of someone who'd seen every kind of traveler the frontier produced. You folks need supplies? Supplies and information, Samuel said, looking for work that might carry us through to California. Carson scratched his beard thoughtfully. Well, I could use some help around here. Loading freight, organizing inventory, that sort of thing. Pays not much, but it includes meals and a place to sleep. Your woman can help my wife in the kitchen if she's willing. Catherine bristled at being called his woman, but she swallowed whatever retort came to mind. I can do kitchen work. Good. You folks can start tomorrow if you're of a mind to. They accepted the offer and spent the next 3 weeks working at Carson's Bend. Samuel loaded freight wagons and helped build a new storage shed, his military discipline and carpentry skills proving useful. Catherine worked in the kitchen and helped Carson's wife, Ellen, with the endless tasks of frontier hospitality: cooking, cleaning, mending, and managing the chaos of a trading post that never quite closed. It was hard work, but honest, and it felt good to be useful for something other than killing or surviving. Samuel found himself falling into rhythms he hadn't known since before the war, waking at dawn, working until dark, falling into exhausted sleep without nightmares. The scars on his head drew stares at first, but people quickly grew accustomed to them, and soon he was just Sam, the quiet fellow who could lift twice his weight and knew how to fix a broken axle. Catherine bloomed in the structure and routine. Color returned to her face, and her smiles came more easily. Ellen treated her with maternal warmth, asking no questions about her past and offering only support for whatever future she chose to build. The 2 women became friends, and Samuel often heard their laughter from the kitchen while he worked in the yard. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sunset, Catherine turned to Samuel with a serious expression. I've been thinking about something. What's that? About us. About what we are to each other. She took his hand. I know we started this journey as strangers, just 2 broken people heading in the same direction. But it's become more than that, hasn't it? Samuel's heart hammered in his chest. It has for me. For me too. And I want to ask you something, but I'm afraid of the answer. Ask anyway. Catherine took a deep breath. Do you think you could love someone like me? Not just tolerate me or feel sorry for me, but actually love me? Despite my past, despite what I've done, despite killing my own child. Samuel turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. Catherine, I already do love you. Have for a while now, I think. Maybe since you touched my scars that first time and didn't look away. Maybe since you told me about Emmett and trusted me with your grief. I don't know exactly when it happened, but it did. Tears streamed down Catherine's face. I don't deserve that. Neither do I. But maybe that's the point. Maybe love isn't about deserving. Maybe it's about choosing each other despite everything, despite the scars and the past and all the reasons it shouldn't work. I love you too, Samuel, more than I thought I could ever love anyone again. Catherine smiled through her tears. So what do we do about it? I think we get married. If you'll have me, that is. If you can stand being tied to a scarred man with nightmares and no prospects beyond working in a trading post. Catherine laughed, the sound bright and genuine. I think I can manage that. They were married a week later by a circuit preacher passing through Carson's Bend. The ceremony was simple, just Catherine and Samuel, the Brennan family, as witnesses, and Ellen and Carson standing up with them. Catherine wore a dress Ellen had altered for her, simple but clean, and Samuel wore a new shirt he'd traded work for. He left his hat on through the ceremony, but it didn't matter. Catherine knew what was beneath it and loved him anyway. When the preacher asked if they took each other for better or worse, in sickness and health, until death parted them, they both answered yes without hesitation. And when he pronounced them married and told Samuel he could kiss his bride, Samuel did so with a tenderness that made Ellen weep and the Brennan children giggle. That night, in the small room Carson had given them above the trading post, Samuel and Catherine lay together as husband and wife for the first time. There was awkwardness and uncertainty, as there always is with new intimacy, but there was also gentleness and care and the profound relief of being truly known by another person. Afterward, as they lay in the darkness, Catherine traced the scars on Samuel's head with gentle fingers. Tell me something. When you finally let go of hunting that Confederate soldier, did you feel relief or regret? Samuel considered the question. Both, I think. Relief that I wasn't carrying that weight anymore. Regret that I'd wasted 5 years on something that didn't matter in the end. But mostly, he paused, searching for the right words. Mostly, I felt like I'd been given my life back. Like I could finally start living instead of just existing. That's how I feel too. Like Emmett's death was so terrible I wanted to die with him, but somehow I didn't. Somehow I kept breathing and moving and eventually found you, found this. She nestled closer to him. Do you think he'd forgive me? For living when he couldn't? For being happy again? I think a child would want his mother to be happy. I think Emmett would want you to have this. A husband, a home, a future. You honored him by taking him to Siringo. Now honor him by living the life he never got to have. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, then nodded against his chest. I'll try. Every day, I'll try. They stayed at Carson's Bend through the winter, saving money and preparing for the journey to California when spring came. Samuel continued working at the trading post, and Catherine surprised everyone, including herself, by showing a talent for keeping accounts and managing inventory. Carson eventually offered to make them partners in the business, but they both knew they wanted to keep moving west, to complete the journey they'd started. When spring arrived and the trails became passable again, they said their goodbyes to Ellen and Carson and the Brennan family, who decided to stay at Carson's Bend for another season. Samuel and Catherine loaded a new wagon, purchased with their savings, with supplies and set out for California together, legally married now, partners in every sense of the word. The journey took 3 months of hard travel, through mountain passes and across deserts that made the stretch between Gila City and Siringo look gentle by comparison. They joined larger wagon trains when they could, traveled alone when they had to, and slowly made their way toward the promised land of California. Along the way, they met other travelers with their own stories of loss and hope. A widow heading west to join her sister. A former slave seeking freedom in a territory where the war's outcome might mean something. A Chinese family escaping persecution in San Francisco's mining camps. Each had their own scars, visible and invisible. Each was running from something or toward something, or both. Samuel and Catherine shared their fire and their food and their stories, finding that the telling made the weight lighter. They spoke of Emmett and the man with the crescent scar, of dance halls and cavalry charges, of grief and revenge and the long road to letting go. And in the telling, they found healing. Not complete, not perfect, but real. They reached California in late summer, when the valleys were golden with dried grass and the air smelled of dust and possibility. They settled in a small town in the northern part of the territory, a place called Cedar Creek that was just beginning to establish itself. Samuel found work as a blacksmith's assistant, learning the trade while using his military discipline to help organize the town's volunteer defense militia. Catherine opened a small school, teaching reading and writing to the children of miners and farmers who wanted their kids to have opportunities they'd never had. It was hard work and uncertain prosperity, but it was theirs. They built a small house on the edge of town, just a few rooms, but sturdy and weather-tight. They planted a garden that struggled in the California soil, but eventually produced vegetables. They made friends and became part of a community that accepted them without asking too many questions about where they'd come from or what they were running from. On their first anniversary, Samuel took Catherine to the small cemetery at the edge of Cedar Creek. They planted a tree there, a young oak sapling, in memory of Emmett James Tilden. It wasn't a grave marker, and it wasn't in Siringo beside his father, but it was a way of keeping his memory alive in this new place they were building. "Do you think we'll ever go back?" Catherine asked as they stood beside the young tree. "To Siringo, I mean, to visit the grave?" Samuel shook his head. "I don't think so. Siringo's part of the past, and we're building something new here. Better to remember him here, in a place full of life, than in a ghost town full of dust and regret." "What about the man who scarred you? Do you ever think about him?" "Sometimes, but it's different now. Not an obsession, just a fact. He's out there somewhere or he's dead, and either way it doesn't define me anymore." Samuel touched the scars on his head, the gesture unconscious now. "These will always be here, but they're just scars. They're not who I am." Catherine took his hand and placed it on her belly, where the first small swell of pregnancy was just becoming visible. "And who are you now?" "A husband, soon to be a father, a blacksmith's assistant and part-time militia organizer, a man trying to build something instead of destroy something." He smiled. "Seems like enough." "More than enough." Their daughter was born the following spring, arriving with the apple blossoms and the promise of warmer weather. They named her Hope, because that's what she represented. Hope for the future. Hope that the cycle of grief and violence could be broken. Hope that two broken people could create something whole and beautiful together. Samuel held his daughter for the first time with trembling hands. This tiny person who knew nothing of wars or revenge or the cruel ways the world could damage you. She looked at him with unfocused, newborn eyes, and he made a silent promise to protect her from the things that had broken him and Catherine, to give her a childhood full of laughter instead of loss. Catherine watched from the bed, exhausted but radiant. "You're going to be a wonderful father." "I don't know the first thing about being a father." "Neither did James. Neither does any man until he has to do it. But you'll learn. We both will." And they did. They learned through late nights and early mornings, through teething and tantrums, and the particular terror of loving something so much it could destroy you to lose it. They learned through the support of their community, through Ellen's letters from Carson's Bend offering advice and encouragement, through trial and error, and the determination to do better than what had been done to them. Hope grew into a bright, curious child who asked endless questions and showed no fear of her father's scars. To her, they were just part of Papa's face, no more remarkable than his brown eyes or calloused hands. She traced them with small fingers while he told her stories, not of war or violence, but of adventure and courage and the importance of choosing kindness over cruelty. Years passed. Samuel's nightmares faded to occasional disturbances rather than nightly torments. Catherine's grief over Emmett became something she carried with grace rather than something that threatened to crush her. They had another child, a son they named James after Catherine's first husband, and then another daughter they named Ellen after the woman who'd shown them kindness at Carson's Bend. They grew older together, their hair graying, their bodies wearing out from hard work and harder living. But they grew together, their love deepening through shared struggles and shared triumphs, through raising children and building a life and choosing each other again and again through all the years that followed. On their 20th anniversary, they sat on the porch of their house, larger now, expanded as their family grew, and watched their children play in the yard. Hope was 17, teaching her younger siblings to read the way Catherine had taught her. James was 12, helping Samuel in the blacksmith shop. Ellen was 8, wild and fearless and full of the kind of joy that could only come from being raised by parents who'd learned not to take happiness for granted. "Do you ever regret it?" Catherine asked, her hand finding Samuel's the way it always did. "Giving up your revenge? Choosing this instead?" Samuel looked at his family, at the life they'd built from the wreckage of who they'd been. "Not for a single moment. Even though you never found him? Even though that Confederate soldier never faced justice for what he did?" "Justice and revenge aren't the same thing. I thought they were, but I was wrong." Samuel squeezed her hand. "He damaged me, but he didn't destroy me. He gave me scars, but those scars led me to you, to this life, to these children. In a strange way, I should probably thank him." Catherine laughed. "That's very philosophical of you. I've had 20 years to think about it. And what have you concluded? That the best revenge is living well, building something good from something terrible, refusing to let the cruelty of the past poison the possibility of the future." He pulled her close. "We survived, Catherine. More than survived. We thrived. That's more than that soldier could ever take from me, no matter how deep he cut." She kissed him, soft and sweet, the kiss of two people who'd earned their happiness through hard-fought battles against their own demons. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright with tears. "I love you, Samuel. Thank you for riding to Siringo with me. Thank you for choosing me when you could have chosen revenge. Thank you for letting me." As the sun set over Cedar Creek, painting the California sky in shades of orange and gold, Samuel and Catherine sat together, surrounded by the evidence of their survival. Their children's laughter filled the air. Their garden bloomed with late summer vegetables. Their house stood solid and welcoming, a testament to what could be built from nothing when two people refused to give up on each other or themselves. The scars remained, both the ones visible on Samuel's head and the invisible ones they both carried from lives marked by violence and loss. But scars were just proof that wounds could heal, that survival was possible, that even the deepest cuts couldn't prevent new growth if you were brave enough to keep living. And they were brave enough. They'd proven that on a desperate journey across Apache territory, when a dance hall woman and a revenge-obsessed soldier had chosen each other over their pasts and discovered that sometimes the most radical act of defiance against a cruel world was simply refusing to let it make you cruel in return. The stars began to appear overhead, the same stars that had watched over them that first night riding from Siringo toward an uncertain future. But they weren't uncertain anymore. They knew exactly where they were, home, with the people they loved, living a life worth living. And if that wasn't a happy ending, it was the truest ending they could have hoped for. Not perfect, not without struggle, but earned through every mile traveled, every choice made, every moment they'd chosen love over hate, hope over despair, and life over the slow death of never letting go. The wagon that had carried them across the desert sat in their barn now, retired from service but kept for sentimental reasons. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Catherine would go sit in it and remember the journey that had brought her here, the boy she'd lost, the man she'd found, the impossible distance between grief and grace, and how she'd somehow managed to travel it without losing herself entirely. Samuel would find her there sometimes, sitting in the wagon bed where Emmett had lain wrapped in canvas, where she'd curled around him one last time before letting him go. He'd climb in beside her, not speaking, just being present the way he'd learned to be present for all of life's sorrows and joys. "Do you think Emmett would like it here?" Catherine asked one such evening. "Do you think he'd be proud of what we've built?" "I think any child would be proud to have a mother as strong as you, as brave as you." "I don't feel brave. I feel lucky. Lucky that I met you. Lucky that the Apaches didn't kill us. Lucky that we found this place and these people and this life. Luck is just what we call it, when we survive long enough to appreciate what we've survived for." Samuel took her hand. "We made our own luck, Catherine, by choosing not to give up, by choosing each other." She leaned her head on his shoulder, the same gesture she'd made 1,000 times over the years, but it never lost its comfort. "Thank you for being the kind of man worth choosing. Thank you for being the kind of woman who saw past the scars." They sat in the old wagon as darkness fell, two survivors who'd become more than survivors, holding each other and the memories they'd transformed from wounds into wisdom. Outside, their children called them to dinner, their voices bright with the uncomplicated joy of childhoods unmarred by the tragedies their parents had endured. Samuel and Catherine rose and walked hand in hand toward their house, toward their family, toward the future they'd built one difficult choice at a time. Behind them, the wagon remained in the barn, a monument to the journey that had saved them both, a reminder that sometimes the only way forward was through the hardest territory you'd ever faced. And they had faced it, together. And on the other side, they'd found not just survival, but something far more precious, a reason to keep choosing life day after day, year after year, until their story became not one of tragedy and revenge, but of redemption and love and the stubborn human refusal to let darkness have the final word. The desert had tried to claim them, but they'd claimed each other instead. And in the end, that made all the difference.